On the family cruise, I caught my daughter-in-law and my husband kissing. I burst out laughing and said, "Enjoy yourselves." My son was devastated, and we returned home immediately. When I got back, I made just one phone call. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The champagne bubbles tickled my throat as I raised my glass to celebrate 35 years of marriage to Lance. The cruise ship's dining room sparkled with crystal and candlelight, and I should have been the happiest woman alive. Instead, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold before me, detached and strangely calm. "To my beautiful wife Edna," Lance announced, his voice carrying across our table. 35 years of pure bliss. Pure bliss. I almost choked on those words. If he only knew what I'd discovered 3 months ago. But I smiled, clinked my glass against his, and played the part of the devoted wife. After all, I'd been perfecting this performance for decades. Hugo, my son, sat beside his wife Fallon, both of them beaming at us. At 28, Hugo still looked at his father with such admiration it made my heart ache. He had no idea what kind of man Lance really was. Fallon, 26 and stunning in that calculated way some women master, kept touching Lance's arm as she spoke. Little gestures that might seem innocent to others, but I'd been watching. I'd been watching for a very long time. "Mom, you look radiant," Hugo said, squeezing my hand. "Doesn't she, Dad?" Lance barely glanced at me. "Absolutely." His eyes were already drifting back to Fallon, who was adjusting her dress strap in a way that seemed deliberate. The movement made her lean closer to him, and I saw his jaw tighten with something that definitely wasn't paternal affection. I excused myself from dinner early, claiming a headache. The truth was, I needed air. I needed space to think. The deck was quieter at this hour, most passengers still enjoying their meals or the evening entertainment. I found a secluded spot near the stern and let the ocean breeze wash over me. That's when I heard them. "We can't keep doing this," Fallon's voice carried on the wind. "Hugo might see us." "Hugo's too busy being the perfect son," Lance replied. "Besides, Edna doesn't suspect anything. She never pays attention to what I do anymore." If he only knew how wrong he was. I moved closer, staying in the shadows. They were standing by the railing, Fallon's back against the metal barrier, Lance caging her in with his arms. The moonlight caught her face as she looked up at him, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen when she looked at my son. Hunger. Raw desire. "What about when we get back?" she whispered. "I can't keep pretending to love Hugo. It's killing me." "Then don't," Lance said, his hand moving to cup her face. "Leave him. We'll figure it out." "And Edna?" Lance's laugh was cold. "Edna will survive. She always does. She's tougher than she looks." That's when he kissed her. Not a gentle peck, not an accident, but a deep, passionate kiss that lasted far too long. Fallon melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and I watched my husband of 35 years betray not just me, but our son. Something inside me snapped, but not in the way you'd expect. I didn't feel rage or heartbreak. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity. I stepped out of the shadows, my heels clicking on the deck. They broke apart like teenagers caught by their parents, Fallon's face flushing red, Lance looking like a deer in headlights. "Well," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "This is interesting." Fallon opened her mouth, probably to make some excuse, but I held up my hand. "Please don't insult my intelligence with explanations," I continued. "I have eyes." Lance straightened, trying to regain his composure. "Edna, it's not what you think." I laughed, actually laughed, a sound that seemed to echo across the water. Both of them stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, or maybe I'd finally found it. "Oh, Lance," I said, wiping a tear from my eye. "It's exactly what I think. And you know what? Good for you both. Really, enjoy yourselves." The shock on their faces was almost comical. They'd expected tears, screaming, drama. Instead, I felt oddly liberated, like a weight I'd been carrying for years had suddenly lifted from my shoulders. "Mom?" Hugo's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him approaching, his face confused as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" I was looking for you and Dad said you were feeling sick, but then I saw you all out here." His voice trailed off as he noticed how close Lance and Fallon were standing, how guilty they both looked. I watched my son's face change as understanding dawned. The confusion gave way to hurt, then to something deeper, more devastating. "Hugo," Fallon started, but he was already backing away. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Neither of them answered. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Hugo looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I walked over to him and placed my hand on his cheek. "I know, sweetheart. Neither did I until tonight." That wasn't entirely true, but he didn't need to know that. Not yet. The rest of the cruise passed in a strange, tense bubble. Lance and Fallon tried to act normal during the day, but the charade was exhausting for everyone. Hugo barely spoke to any of us, spending most of his time alone in his cabin or walking the deck by himself. I played the role of the shocked, hurt wife, but inside, I was planning. On our last night, as we packed our bags, I made a phone call. "Marcus? It's Edna. Yes, I know what time it is. We need to talk the moment I get back. Yes, it's time. After all these years, it's finally time." I hung up and looked at myself in the mirror. At 63, I still had fight in me, more fight than Lance had ever given me credit for. Tomorrow, when we docked, my real life would begin. The woman staring back at me in the reflection smiled. She looked like someone who just remembered her own power. The taxi pulled away from the dock, leaving the cruise ship behind us like a bad dream. Hugo sat in the front seat, staring out the window with hollow eyes. Lance and Fallon rode in uncomfortable silence in the back with me, the tension so thick I could practically taste it. Nobody spoke during the 2-hour drive home, but I was thinking, God, was I thinking. People always underestimated me. Lance had been doing it for 35 years, treating me like a pretty ornament he'd married for show. Even Hugo, bless his heart, saw me as this fragile woman who needed protecting. They had no idea that behind my smile and my perfectly coordinated outfits, I'd been paying attention to everything. The moment we pulled into our driveway, Hugo grabbed his bag and headed straight for his car. "Son," Lance called after him, but Hugo didn't even turn around. "Don't," Hugo said, his voice flat. "Just don't." Fallon started to follow him, her face painted with fake remorse. "Hugo, please, we need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about." Hugo's words cut through the evening air like a blade. "Pack your things, Fallon. Be gone by tomorrow." She stood there in her designer dress, looking lost for the first time since I'd known her. Good. Let her feel what uncertainty was like. Lance tried to approach me as we walked toward the house. "Edna, we should discuss later," I said calmly. "I need some time to process all of this." He nodded, probably thinking he was getting off easy. If he only knew. Once inside, I went straight to my study and closed the door. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady as I pulled out my phone and dialed Marcus's number. Marcus Chen had been my friend since law school, back when I was studying to be a lawyer myself, before I gave it all up to be Lance's wife, before I became invisible. "Edna," his voice was warm but concerned. "I got your message from the ship. Are you all right?" "I'm perfect, Marcus. Better than I've been in years." "What happened on that cruise?" I told him everything. The kiss, Lance and Fallon's conversation, their plans to be together. But then I told him something else, something I'd been keeping to myself for 3 long months. "Marcus, remember when you handled our estate planning 5 years ago? When we restructured everything?" "Of course. We put most of the assets in your name for tax purposes. Lance insisted on it, said it would save money in the long run." "Exactly. And remember the private investigator you recommended when I suspected Lance was having an affair? Daniel Rodriguez. Did he find something?" I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside were photographs, hotel receipts, phone records, and bank statements going back 3 years. Not just of Fallon, but of 2 other women before her. Lance hadn't just betrayed me once. He'd made a career of it. He found everything, Marcus. Lance has been cheating on me with multiple women for years. Fallon is just the latest. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Edna, why didn't you confront him earlier?" I leaned back in my chair, a smile playing on my lips, because I was waiting for the right moment, and now, thanks to this cruise, I have it. He's not just cheating on me, Marcus. He's planning to dump me for our daughter-in-law. He's planning to destroy Hugo's marriage and our family for his own selfish desires. What do you want to do? I want to file for divorce, immediately, and I want everything. Everything? The house, the company, the investments, the vacation home in Aspen, all of it. Lance thinks he's been the breadwinner all these years, but legally I own it all. He's just been the face of the operation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Edna, are you sure about this? Divorce at your age, after 35 years of marriage? Marcus, I'm 63, not 90. I have plenty of life left to live, and I'm not spending it pretending I don't know what my husband is doing behind my back. And your son? My heart clenched a little at that. Hugo will understand eventually. He's a good man, nothing like his father. He deserves better than Fallon, and I'm going to make sure he sees who she really is. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my study for a long time, looking at the family photos on my desk. There was our wedding picture, me at 28 in my white dress, looking so hopeful. Pictures of Hugo as a baby, a toddler, graduating from college. Pictures of Christmases and birthdays and anniversaries, all of us smiling for the camera. But how many of those smiles were real? I heard Lance moving around upstairs, probably in his study, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I heard Fallon in the guest room, talking on her phone in hushed tones. And I heard Hugo's car pull away from the driveway, probably going to his apartment across town to lick his wounds. My family was falling apart. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Lance came downstairs. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. "We need to talk," he said. "Do we?" He sat down at the kitchen island, running his hands through his hair. "Look, Edna, I know how this looks, but it's not what you think." I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Really? Because what I think is that you've been having an affair with our son's wife. What I think is that you're planning to leave me for a woman 37 years younger than you. What I think is that you've been lying to me for God knows how long." His face went pale. "How did you? I heard you talking on the ship, Lance. I heard everything." For a moment, he looked like he might deny it all, but then his shoulders sagged. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? I never meant for you to find out this way. I was going to tell you." "When? After you'd figured out how to take half of everything in the divorce?" He looked up sharply. "What are you talking about?" I smiled. "Oh, Lance. Sweet, arrogant Lance. You really don't know, do you?" "Know what?" "Who actually owns everything?" The color drained from his face completely. He sat there, staring at me, as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. All these years, he'd thought he was the powerful one, the successful businessman with the trophy wife. He'd never bothered to read the fine print on his own estate planning. "Edna," he said slowly, "what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, darling. You did it all yourself. Remember 5 years ago when you insisted we restructure our assets for tax purposes? You put everything in my name. The house, the company, the investments, all of it." He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. And Marcus is filing the divorce papers today." That's when Fallon appeared in the doorway, her suitcase in hand, looking like she'd been crying. "Lance? What's going on?" I heard raised voices. Lance looked at her, then back at me, and I saw the exact moment he realized that his perfect plan had just become his perfect nightmare. The chess pieces were moving, and for the first time in 35 years, I was the one making the moves. The divorce papers arrived at Lance's office on Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who probably had no idea he was carrying a bomb. I know this because Marcus called me at exactly 9:47 a.m. to tell me Lance had just phoned him screaming. He used some very colorful language, Marcus said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. I particularly enjoyed the part where he called you a conniving witch. I told him that conniving witches don't usually wait 3 months to file papers after hiring a private investigator. I was sitting in my garden, drinking tea and watching the roses I'd planted 20 years ago bloom in the morning sun. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. "How bad is it for him?" I asked. "Edna, it's devastating. Everything is in your name. The house, the business, the vacation properties, even his precious classic car collection. Legally, he has no claim to any of it. And the business? That's the beautiful part. Hartwell Industries has been operating under your ownership for 5 years. Lance has been essentially an employee, even though he's been acting like the CEO. Without your signature, he can't make any major decisions, can't access the primary accounts, can't even sell company assets." I felt a little thrill of satisfaction. For 35 years, Lance had made me feel like a decoration, a pretty accessory to his successful life. He'd never bothered to learn that I'd graduated summa cum laude from law school, that I understood contracts and business structures better than he ever had. He'd just assumed I was too simple to pay attention to the paperwork I was signing. What's his next move likely to be? He'll probably try to negotiate, offer you a settlement to avoid a messy divorce. He's going to argue that he built the business, that his efforts made the money, that you don't deserve everything. And legally? Legally, he doesn't have a leg to stand on. But Edna, are you prepared for this to get ugly? Because it will. I looked at my roses, thinking about how long it had taken them to grow, how much care and patience they'd required. "Marcus, I've been preparing for this for 3 months. I'm ready." What I didn't tell him was that I'd been preparing for much longer than that. That afternoon, Fallon showed up at my door. She looked terrible, her usually perfect makeup smudged, her designer clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them, which she probably had, considering Hugo had thrown her out. "Edna, please, we need to talk." I let her in, more out of curiosity than kindness. She stood in my living room, looking around at the home she'd probably been planning to redecorate once she became the lady of the house. "I know you're angry," she began. "Do I seem angry to you?" She blinked, clearly thrown off by my calm tone. Well, no, but you should be. I betrayed your son. I had an affair with your husband. You should be furious." I sat down in my favorite armchair, the one Lance had always complained was too feminine for his taste. "Fallon, let me ask you something. When did it start? The affair? The planning, the conversations about leaving your spouses. When did you and Lance start plotting this new life together?" She shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't like that. It just happened." "Nothing just happens, dear. Especially not something this elaborate. You didn't accidentally fall into bed with my husband. You didn't accidentally discuss leaving Hugo. You made choices." Her facade started to crack. "You don't understand. Lance and we have a connection. Something real." "I'm sure you do. A connection to his bank account. That's not fair." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what's fair, Fallon. Fair would have been you divorcing my son before you started sleeping with his father. Fair would have been Lance asking for a divorce before he betrayed his own child. Fair would have been either of you having the decency to consider how this would destroy Hugo." Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but they looked calculated, practiced. We tried to fight it, but we couldn't help ourselves. "Oh, spare me the star-crossed lovers routine. You helped yourself to my husband because you thought he came with money and status. Now you're about to find out just how wrong you were. What do you mean?" I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the garden. "Lance doesn't own any of this, Fallon. Not the house, not the business, not the cars, not the vacation homes. It's all mine." The silence behind me was deafening. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it? Did you ever actually look at any legal documents? Or did you just assume that because Lance acted like the big man, he actually owned everything?" When I turned around, her face was white as paper. "But he said, he promised. He promised you what? A life of luxury? A wealthy husband? A big house and expensive cars?" She nodded, looking like a child who'd just learned Santa Claus wasn't real. "Well, congratulations. You got yourself a 67-year-old man with no assets, no income, and no prospects. I hope the sex was worth it." She stared at me for a long moment, Then something shifted in her expression. The fake remorse disappeared, replaced by something harder, more calculating. You can't do this. You can't take everything. Lance worked for those companies. He built that business. Watch me. Hugo will never forgive you if you destroy his father. That hit closer to home than I wanted to admit, but I kept my expression neutral. Hugo is a smart man. He'll understand that actions have consequences. You're making a mistake, Edna. Lance won't go down without a fight. I'm counting on it. After she left, I called Hugo. He'd been avoiding my calls since we got back from the cruise, and I couldn't blame him. His world had been turned upside down in the space of one evening. Mom? His voice sounded tired, defeated. How are you holding up, sweetheart? I've been better. I filed for divorce this morning. My heart ached for him. At 38, he'd thought he'd found his forever person. Instead, he'd married a woman who was sleeping with his father. I'm proud of you. Are you? Because I feel like an idiot. How did I not see it? How long was this going on right under my nose? I had the private investigators' reports. I knew exactly how long it had been going on, and I knew Hugo didn't want to hear the truth. Does it matter? What matters is that you found the strength to walk away. Dad called me today. Did he? He wants to meet for lunch. Says he can explain everything. Make me understand. I gripped the phone tighter. What did you tell him? I told him I never wanted to see him again. And how do you feel about that? There was a long pause. Empty. I feel empty, Mom. Like everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. Not everything, Hugo. I'm still here. I'm still your mother, and I still love you more than anything in this world. Even though I brought Fallon into our lives, you fell in love with someone who turned out to be different than you thought. That doesn't make you responsible for her choices. We talked for another hour, and by the time I hung up, I felt more determined than ever. Lance and Fallon had made their choices. They'd betrayed the people who loved them most, destroyed a family, broken my son's heart. And they'd done it all because they thought they were entitled to a life they hadn't earned. But they'd forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't the helpless, decorative wife they thought I was. I was Edna Hartwell, and I'd been underestimated for the last time. The next morning, I drove to the offices of Hartwell Industries for the first time in 5 years. The receptionist looked surprised to see me. Mrs. Hartwell, how nice to see you. Are you here to see Mr. Hartwell? Actually, I'm here to see the books. I'm the owner of this company, and I'd like to review our financial situation. The confusion on her face was almost comical. I'm not sure I understand. Get me the CFO, please, and call a company-wide meeting for this afternoon. It's time everyone met the real boss. As I sat in the conference room waiting for the meeting to begin, I thought about all the years I'd spent in the background, letting Lance take credit for decisions we'd made together, strategies I'd suggested, ideas I'd developed. Everyone thought of me as Lance's wife, but they were about to learn who I really was. The game was just beginning, and for the first time in decades, I was playing to win. The company meeting was everything I'd hoped it would be. 23 employees packed into the main conference room, all of them expecting to see Lance walk through the door. Instead, they got me. I'd dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit that commanded respect, my grandmother's pearls, and the confident smile I'd been practicing in the mirror for months. When I walked into that room, I wasn't Lance's wife anymore. I was the owner of a multi-million-dollar company. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Edna Hartwell, and I own this company. The silence was deafening. I could see the confusion on their faces, the sideways glances, the uncertainty. They'd all assumed Lance was the boss because that's what he'd let them believe. I know this comes as a surprise. For the past 5 years, my husband has been acting as the face of the company while I've remained in the background. But due to recent circumstances, I'll be taking a more active role in day-to-day operations. That's when Janet from accounting raised her hand tentatively. Mrs. Hartwell, is Mr. Hartwell ill? No, Janet. Mr. Hartwell is getting divorced. The room erupted in whispers. I let them talk for a moment, then cleared my throat. I want to be clear about something. This company will continue to operate as it always has. Your jobs are secure, your benefits remain the same. The only thing that's changing is management. That's when Michael, our head of sales, spoke up. With all due respect, Mrs. Hartwell, Lance has been running this company for 15 years. He knows every client, every contract, every deal in the pipeline. Does he? I opened the folder I'd brought with me. Because according to these financial records, which I've been reviewing all morning, several of our biggest clients have contracts that are set to expire in the next 6 months. Has Lance been working on renewals? Michael looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure. And what about the Henderson account? The one worth $2 million annually? The contract expired 3 weeks ago, and I don't see any documentation of a renewal meeting. The room was getting quieter by the minute. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, Lance has been coasting for the past 2 years. He's been so focused on his personal life that he's let this business slide. That ends now. I spent the next hour going through every account, every missed opportunity, every dropped ball. By the time I was finished, it was clear to everyone in the room that I knew more about the current state of the company than Lance did. As people filed out, I heard Janet whisper to Michael, "I had no idea she was so sharp. Lance always made her sound like she just planned charity events. Charity events, as if organizing fundraisers that brought in millions of dollars for local hospitals was somehow beneath notice." That evening, Lance finally came home. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for one, when he burst through the door like a man possessed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't look up from chopping vegetables. "Making dinner. There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you're hungry. Don't play games with me, Edna. I know you went to the office today. I know you called that meeting. Did I? I can't imagine why that would concern you. After all, it's my company." He slammed his hand on the counter so hard the cutting board jumped. "It's our company. I built that business from nothing." That's when I finally looked at him. Really looked at him. At 67, Lance was still handsome in that silver fox way that attracted younger women. But standing there in my kitchen, red-faced and desperate, he looked older than his years. "Did you?" "Because I seem to remember co-signing the original business loan. I remember using my inheritance from my father as startup capital. I remember working 18-hour days for the first 5 years, handling the books, managing client relationships, developing our marketing strategy. You were my partner. I was your wife. There's a difference. Partners get equal credit. Wives get patronized and dismissed." His expression shifted, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse. "Edna, I never meant to make you feel, save it, Lance. The time for that conversation was 20 years ago. Now it's too late. It doesn't have to be too late. We can work this out. I made a mistake with Fallon, but we can get past this." I laughed, actually laughed at the audacity of it. "A mistake? You've been having an affair with our son's wife. You've been planning to leave me for her. You've been telling her about the wonderful life you'd build together with money that isn't even yours. That's not a mistake, Lance. That's a character flaw. I'll end it with her. I'll tell her it was all a mistake." "Too late for that, too. She's already moved in with you." His face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Check your apartment, Lance. The one downtown that you thought I didn't know about? The one you've been paying for with company funds for the past 2 years. Fallon moved in yesterday. I'd discovered the apartment 6 months ago when I was reviewing the company's expense reports. A monthly payment to a property management company, listed under executive housing. At first, I'd thought it was for out-of-town clients. Then the private investigator had sent me photos of Lance and various women entering and leaving the building. How did you... I know everything, Lance. I've known for months. The apartment, the affairs, the money you've been skimming from the company for your little love nest. Did you really think I was too stupid to notice?" He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to experience consequences for the first time in your adult life." "Edna, please. You're angry, I understand that. But if you destroy me, you destroy yourself too. The company needs both of us." "Does it?" "Because from what I saw today, the company has been running just fine without your input. In fact, it might run better." That's when my phone rang. It was Hugo. "Mom, are you okay? I heard from someone at Dad's office that there was some kind of meeting today." "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just introduced myself to the staff." "What do you mean?" I mean, I reminded them who actually owns the company they work for. There was a pause. Mom, what's going on? Really? I looked at Lance, who was staring at me with something between fear and fury. Your father made some assumptions about our marriage, about our finances, about his own importance. He's currently learning that those assumptions were wrong. Is that why Fallon called me today crying about how Dad promised her things he can't deliver? My heart clenched. She called you? She wanted to come back, said she'd made a terrible mistake, that she loved me, that Dad had lied to her about his financial situation. What did you tell her? I told her that ship had sailed. But Mom, she seemed genuinely shocked that Dad doesn't actually own anything. She kept asking me if it was true that you owned the house and the business. It's true. All of it? Every single asset. Your father has been living in my house, driving my cars, and running my company for 5 years. He just never bothered to pay attention to the paperwork. Hugo was quiet for a long moment. Jesus, Mom. Dad's been bragging to everyone about his success, his business acumen, his empire. And none of it was ever his? None of it. That's actually kind of brilliant, in a terrifying way. After I hung up, Lance was still sitting at the kitchen table, but something had changed in his demeanor. The anger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. Fallon left me, he said quietly. I heard. She said I was a liar and a fraud. She said I'd ruined her life. Did you? He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the man I'd married. Vulnerable, uncertain, almost childlike in his confusion. I thought I loved her. No, Lance, you loved the idea of her. You loved feeling young and desired and powerful. You loved having a beautiful woman half your age make you feel like you were still the man you used to be. Maybe you're right. I know I'm right. The question is, what are you going to do now? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. I don't know. I've never not known what to do next. Well, I said, returning to my vegetables, I suggest you figure it out quickly, because tomorrow the locks on this house are being changed, and the company credit cards are being canceled. Whatever you're going to do with your life, you're going to do it without my money. That night, I lay in bed alone for the first time in 35 years, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt free. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Patricia Whitmore at the farmer's market. Patricia had been part of our social circle for 20 years, one of those women who thrived on gossip and drama, but always presented herself as deeply concerned about everyone's well-being. Edna, she called out, hurrying over with that particular expression people wear when they're about to deliver news they think will devastate you. How are you holding up, dear? I'm wonderful, Patricia. How are you? She blinked, clearly thrown off by my cheerful tone. Well, I'm fine, but I meant, after everything that's happened, you'll have to be more specific. Patricia glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned in closer. I saw Lance yesterday, downtown, near the shelter. He looked rough, Edna, really rough. I selected a perfect tomato from the vendor's display, examining it carefully. Did he? Yes. And I have to say, I'm shocked at how this whole situation has played out. I mean, everyone knows about Fallon, of course, but to see a man of Lance's stature reduced to, well... She trailed off, waiting for me to ask for details. When I didn't, she continued anyway. He's living in that awful extended stay motel on 5th Street. Can you imagine? And his clothes. Edna, he was wearing the same shirt I saw him in 3 days ago. It wasn't even clean. I handed the vendor my money and placed the tomatoes in my basket. That sounds like a series of choices Lance made for himself. But surely you can't be happy about this. He's still Hugo's father. For the first time in the conversation, I looked directly at her. Patricia, are you suggesting that I should have continued to finance my ex-husband's lifestyle after he had an affair with our daughter-in-law? Her face flushed. Well, no, but there's a difference between not supporting him and leaving him with absolutely nothing. Is there? Because it seems to me that leaving him with nothing is exactly what he deserves after 35 years of taking everything. As I walked away, I could feel Patricia staring after me. By evening, my phone was ringing with calls from other women in our former social circle, all wanting to know if it was true that I'd destroyed Lance. The truth was, I hadn't destroyed Lance. Lance had destroyed himself. I'd simply stopped enabling the destruction. What Patricia hadn't told me, but what I learned from other sources over the following weeks, was that Lance's fall from grace had been swift and brutal. Without access to company funds, he couldn't maintain the apartment where Fallon had been living. She'd moved out within a week of discovering he was broke, leaving behind a note that simply said, "This isn't what you promised me." He'd tried to get a job, but at 67, with no real skills beyond talking a good game, his options were limited. The few interviews he'd managed to secure had gone poorly. Apparently, when you've spent decades having other people handle the actual work while you took credit, you don't develop many marketable abilities. Hugo told me Lance had called him repeatedly, asking for money, for help, for just a chance to explain. Hugo had been polite, but firm. "I told him I wasn't interested in funding his midlife crisis," Hugo said during one of our weekly dinners. "He made his choices. Now he has to live with them. How do you feel about that?" Hugo considered the question carefully. He'd been doing a lot of thinking over the past months, working with a therapist to process the betrayal and his feelings about our family's implosion. "Honestly, I feel sorry for him, but not sorry enough to bail him out. He betrayed both of us, Mom. He chose Fallon over his own family. The fact that it didn't work out the way he planned doesn't make me responsible for fixing his mistakes." Meanwhile, Fallon's own story was unfolding in predictable ways. After leaving Lance, she'd tried to reconcile with Hugo. When that failed, she'd moved back in with her parents, much to their mortification. At 26, she was back in her childhood bedroom, explaining to her mother why her marriage had ended and why she'd been foolish enough to leave a good man for an old one with no money. I learned about Fallon's situation through my hairdresser, of all people. Maria had been doing my hair for 15 years, and she had a network of gossip that rivaled the FBI. "She's working at that new restaurant on Maple Street," Maria told me as she trimmed my gray roots. "The one with the fancy name but cheap prices. My cousin Rosa works in the kitchen there, and she says Fallon cries during every shift." "Does she?" "Rosa says she keeps talking about how she made the biggest mistake of her life, how she threw away everything good for a fantasy. She asks about Hugo sometimes, whether he's dating anyone new. And is he?" Maria grinned in the mirror. "Rosa says there's a lovely woman named Jennifer who comes in with him sometimes. A teacher, very sweet. Nothing like Fallon." That made me smile. Hugo deserved someone genuine, someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he could provide. But the most satisfying piece of information came from an unexpected source. I was at the grocery store when I saw Todd Henderson, one of Lance's former golf buddies. Todd had always been polite to me, but clearly saw me as an appendage to Lance rather than a person in my own right. "Edna," he said, approaching me cautiously, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look fantastic. Divorce suits you." I almost laughed at his surprised tone. "Thank you, Todd. I have to ask, and I hope this isn't inappropriate, but is it true that Lance never actually owned Hartwell Industries?" "It's true," Todd shook his head in amazement. "All those years, listening to him brag about his business empire, his success, his deals, and it was your company the whole time? For the past 5 years, yes. Wow. That's actually incredible. I mean, the man spent decades acting like he was this self-made business tycoon, and he was essentially working for his wife. Ex-wife. Right, ex-wife. But Edna, can I ask you something else?" "Of course. How did you keep quiet about it for so long? I mean, all those dinner parties where Lance would hold court, talking about his strategies and his vision for the company. You never once corrected him." I thought about that question for a moment. I suppose I was waiting for the right time to set the record straight. And was this the right time? It was perfect timing. As Todd walked away, I realized that Lance's social destruction was almost complete. The men who had once looked up to him, who had sought his advice and admired his success, now saw him as a fraud and a fool. The women who had flattered and fawned over him now whispered about his fall from grace. He'd gone from being the center of attention to being a cautionary tale. The final piece of Lance's downfall came through Hugo, who called me one evening with a mixture of sadness and disgust in his voice. "Mom, I saw Dad today. How did he look?" "Terrible. He was panhandling downtown near the bus station. He asked me for $20. My heart clenched, not with sympathy for Lance, but with pain for my son, who was having to watch his father's complete degradation. Did you give it to him? No, but Mom, it was hard. He looked so broken. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he just needed a little help to get back on his feet. What did you tell him? I told him that sorry doesn't undo the damage, that being broke doesn't erase the fact that he chose to betray his family, and I told him that if he wanted help, he should ask the woman he threw away his marriage for. That must have been difficult. It was, but it was also necessary. I can't keep being the son who makes excuses for his father's behavior. At some point, people have to face the consequences of their choices. That night, I stood on my back porch, looking out at the garden I'd spent 20 years cultivating. The roses were blooming again, fuller and more beautiful than ever. I'd hired a gardener to help maintain the larger areas, and I'd been spending more time out there myself, finding peace in the work of nurturing growing things. My phone buzzed with a text from Hugo. "Dinner tomorrow? I want you to meet Jennifer." I smiled and typed back, "I'd love to." The next morning I drove past the extended stay motel on 5th Street. I didn't see Lance, but I saw his car in the parking lot, the luxury sedan that had once been a symbol of his success, now looking shabby and out of place among the rusty trucks and beat-up economy cars. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, but I felt no guilt either. Lance had spent 35 years making choices, and now he was living with the results. It wasn't my job to rescue him from himself anymore. As I drove home to prepare for dinner with Hugo and Jennifer, I realized that I'd never felt more at peace. The chaos was over. The betrayal was behind me. And for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years after the divorce, I was standing in my kitchen making Sunday dinner when I heard the doorbell ring. Through the window, I could see Hugo's car in the driveway, but there was another car I didn't recognize. A small smile played on my lips as I wiped my hands on my apron and went to answer the door. Hugo stood there with Jennifer, the woman who had quietly become the light of his life over the past 18 months. She was nothing like Fallon. No designer clothes, no calculated beauty, no manipulative charm. Jennifer was real in a way that made you feel comfortable just being in her presence. "Mom," Hugo said, pulling me into a hug. "You remember Jennifer." "Of course. How are you, sweetheart?" Jennifer smiled, holding up a bottle of wine. "I brought your favorite. Hugo told me you like the Pinot Grigio from that little vineyard in Sonoma." It still amazed me how much attention Jennifer paid to small details, how she made an effort to know the people in Hugo's life. The contrast with Fallon, who had lived in our family for 3 years without ever bothering to learn what I liked or cared about, was striking. As we settled into dinner, Jennifer asked about the company. It had become a frequent topic of conversation, not because she was nosy, but because she was genuinely interested in my work. "How are the Henderson contract negotiations going?" "Better than expected," I said, serving the roast. "It turns out that when you actually pay attention to what clients need instead of just trying to impress them, they're much more willing to work with you." Hugo laughed. "Mom's being modest. She landed the biggest contract in the company's history last month." "It wasn't that difficult," I said, though I was pleased by his pride. "I just listened to what they wanted and gave it to them." What I didn't say was that the success felt different now. For 35 years, every business victory had been shared with Lance, or more accurately, claimed by Lance. Now, when good things happened, they were mine. The satisfaction was pure, uncomplicated by resentment or the need to make someone else look good. After dinner, Hugo and Jennifer helped clear the table, and we settled in the living room with coffee. That's when Hugo brought up the subject I'd been expecting. "Mom, I saw Dad last week." Jennifer tensed slightly beside him. She'd heard all the stories, understood the history, but she still felt uncomfortable when the subject of Lance came up. "How is he?" Hugo's expression was complicated, a mixture of sadness and frustration that I'd seen often over the past 2 years. "Not good. He's lost more weight and he looks older, much older." "Where did you see him?" "He was outside the coffee shop on Main Street. I think he was hoping I'd come out, maybe give him money." "Did you?" "No, but we talked for a few minutes." Jennifer reached over and squeezed Hugo's hand. She understood how difficult these encounters were for him, the internal struggle between the son who remembered loving his father and the man who couldn't forgive what that father had done. What did he say? The usual, that he's sorry, that he made mistakes, that he wants to make things right. But then he asked about you. What about me? He wanted to know if you were dating anyone, if you were happy, if you ever talked about him. I set down my coffee cup, considering how to respond. What did you tell him? I told him you were thriving, that you'd built a life he'd never been part of and never could be part of, that you were happier now than I'd ever seen you. And how did he react to that? Hugo was quiet for a moment. He cried, Mom. Just stood there on the sidewalk and cried like a child. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. I'm sorry you had to see that. Are you sorry for him? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself for 2 years. I'm sorry for the man he could have been. I'm sorry for the life we could have had if he'd been capable of being honest and faithful, but I'm not sorry for the man he chose to become. Jennifer spoke up for the first time. Hugo told me about Fallon. Do you ever wonder what happened to her? I did know what had happened to Fallon, though I didn't go looking for information. In a town our size, news traveled whether you wanted it to or not. She'd worked at 3 different restaurants over the past 2 years, never lasting more than 6 months at any of them. Currently, she was waitressing at a truck stop outside town, living in a studio apartment that probably cost more than she could afford. I heard she's still in town, I said carefully. She tried to contact Hugo last month, Jennifer said, glancing at him. Called his office. Hugo nodded grimly. She wanted to meet for coffee. Said she had things she needed to say to me. Did you meet with her? No, I told her we had nothing to discuss. But she kept calling, Jennifer added. Finally, Hugo had to block her number. I looked at my son, seeing the man he'd become over the past 2 years. The experience had aged him, but it had also strengthened him. He'd learned to set boundaries, to protect himself, to choose people who were worthy of his trust. I'm proud of you, I told him. For what? For not letting guilt manipulate you into situations you don't want to be in. Later that evening, after Hugo and Jennifer had left, I sat in my study looking at the company reports for the quarter. Hartwell Industries was more profitable than it had ever been. We'd expanded into 2 new markets, hired 12 new employees, and established a reputation for reliability that was attracting bigger clients. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the numbers. It was in the knowledge that I'd built this success myself, that every decision had been mine, every strategy had come from my own mind. At 65, I was finally living the life I'd always been capable of living. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Mrs. Hartwell? The voice was female, young, uncertain. Yes? This is Sarah Chen from the Herald Tribune. I'm working on a story about successful female entrepreneurs over 60, and your name came up as someone I should interview. I leaned back in my chair, amused. Did it? Yes, ma'am. The business community is talking about how you've transformed Hartwell Industries since taking over active management. Would you be interested in speaking with me? What kind of story are you writing? It's about women who found their professional voices later in life. Women who maybe spent years in supporting roles, but then stepped into leadership and thrived. I thought about that for a moment. 2 years ago, I would have deflected, would have said I wasn't comfortable with publicity. But that woman was gone. I'd be happy to speak with you. After I hung up, I walked out to my garden. It was late autumn, and most of the flowers had finished blooming, but the structure of the beds remained beautiful. I'd learned over the years that a good garden wasn't just about the flowers. It was about the bones underneath, the foundation that remained strong when the showy parts faded. That's what I'd become, I realized. I'd stopped being the flower in someone else's garden and had become the gardener of my own life. A year later, the newspaper article had led to speaking engagements, which had led to consulting opportunities with other women-owned businesses. I'd become something I'd never expected. A role model for women who wanted to reclaim their own power. Hugo had married Jennifer in a small ceremony in my garden, surrounded by people who genuinely loved them both. Watching them exchange vows, seeing the way they looked at each other with respect and genuine affection, I felt a deep satisfaction. My son had learned to choose better. As for Lance and Fallon, they'd become footnotes in other people's stories. Lance was still in town, still struggling, still occasionally trying to contact Hugo for money. Fallon had finally left, moving to another state to start over somewhere her reputation hadn't preceded her. They'd become cautionary tales, examples of what happened when you betrayed the people who loved you most. But I rarely thought about them anymore. They belonged to my past, and my past no longer defined me. Standing in my kitchen this morning, preparing for another Sunday dinner with Hugo and Jennifer, I caught my reflection in the window. At 65, I looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she wanted from life. The girl who had married Lance at 28, so eager to please and so afraid of conflict, was gone. The woman who had spent 35 years making excuses for her husband's behavior was gone. The wife who had hidden her intelligence and competence to make someone else feel important was gone. In their place stood someone I was proud to be, Edna Hartwell, successful business owner, devoted mother, and architect of her own contentment. The doorbell rang, announcing Hugo and Jennifer's arrival, and I smiled as I went to answer it. This was my life now, and it was exactly what I'd made it. Peaceful, genuine, and entirely my own. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.